He read it, his fingers trembling. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "I never deserved her," he whispered. "No," Miss Marple said. "But she deserved to be remembered as more than someone's tragedy." She stood, walked to the door and paused. She was going to name the dress after her, she said softly. The Isabel gown. She wrote it on the inside of her sketchbook. Felton didn't speak. He only nodded and sat with the dress in his lap as the door clicked quietly shut. Miss Marple met Craddock at the corner of Nettleridge Lane. The inspector looked at her face and said nothing at first. "You have your man?" she asked. Craddock nodded. "He confessed." "And the girl?" "Julia's been told. She's gone to stay with an aunt near the coast. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere she can decide what kind of future she wants." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Good," the inspector exhaled. "You were right, you know, about the truth. It's never tidy." "No," she agreed. "But it's necessary." They stood for a while, watching the slow fall of snow over the green where the arbor now stood undisturbed. "A child without a name," Craddock said. "A mother with too many, and a man who couldn't let go. And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "the threads still form a pattern. Even in tragedy we see it, the need for connection, and the cost of its absence." He turned to her. "How do you always know?" "I watch people, Inspector, and I remember. That's all." They parted quietly, without ceremony, as snow fell like dust over the village's buried secrets. Winter deepened in Little Davington. Snow now settled firmly in corners and hedgerows, the rooftops draped in a hush of white that softened even the harshest outlines of the village. Yet despite the season's peace, a kind of tension still lingered in the air, an invisible pressure that had not quite dissipated with Anne Prowse's arrest or Andrew Felton's confession. Because truth, Miss Marple often observed, is not simply a matter of fact. It is the unfolding of hidden truths, the slow undoing of lies sewn into the very fabric of daily life. It is never enough to name a murderer. One must explain why and, more importantly, how it all came together. So, when Inspector Craddock asked Miss Marple if she would care to join him in presenting the final explanation to the key figures of the village, those most affected and most involved, she agreed. "With one condition. It must be private," she said. "We owe the girl that." And so it was that on a late afternoon, in the vicarage's parlour, familiar, firelit, and framed by mullioned windows, they gathered Julia Prowse, pale but composed, the vicar and his wife seated protectively near her, Beatrice Grantley summoned for her role in stirring suspicions, and of course Craddock and Miss Marple side by side in straight-backed chairs like the most unassuming of magistrates. "I thought," Craddock began, "it would be best for everyone to understand what happened, not just the act of murder, but the sequence of choices, grievances, and misjudgments that led to it." He gestured to Miss Marple. She inclined her head slightly and began, her voice low but crisp. "This began with Lillian Rowe," she said, "a woman who disappeared from public life a decade ago following the presumed death of her abusive husband, Michael Rowe. That disappearance was an act of survival, an escape from a life that had already destroyed her in part. She left behind a daughter," Craddock added, "a child later placed in foster care, renamed Julia Prowse. Julia looked down, but her hands did not tremble. Lillian came here under a false name," Miss Marple continued, "as Margaret Harding. She worked quietly, sewed meticulously, and lived a life of discretion. She believed her past was behind her until she began searching for her daughter. There was a murmur among the room's occupants. Beatrice shifted uncomfortably. She discovered where Julia lived," Craddock said, "and arranged a chance meeting, hoping for a gradual reintroduction. They met often," Miss Marple said gently, looking to Julia. In secret at first. A dress was begun, plans were made, and though there was pain in it, there was hope too. The girl gave a tiny nod. Her eyes were dry, but they shimmered. But someone else was watching, Miss Marple said, turning her gaze to Beatrice Grantley. A woman who had grown suspicious, who had overheard bits of conversation, who knew in the way women do when something is being hidden. And that woman, perhaps believing she was protecting the girl, or perhaps simply acting from spite, told others what she suspected. Beatrice opened her mouth, then closed it again. She folded her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl being reprimanded. One of those others, Miss Marple continued, was Andrew Felton. Craddock took over. Mr. Felton had grown attached to Lillian. It was not simply infatuation, it was possession. When he learned she was planning to leave, to take Julia and disappear again, he felt betrayed, and in a moment of rage he followed her to the fete. And struck her, Miss Marple said, but did not kill her, not immediately. There was a silence now, a tension. And that, Miss Marple said softly, is when Anne Prowse acted. Julia turned her face away. She had followed Julia to the fete, Miss Marple continued. She knew or suspected the truth. She feared what would happen if Lillian reclaimed her child. Perhaps she feared losing control, losing a place she had come to see as her own. So when she found Lillian injured but alive, she acted swiftly. She delivered the fatal blow. Then she vanished into the crowd. Later, Craddock said, Felton would return, uncertain whether Lillian had lived or died from his assault. When he saw her dead, he believed himself guilty of it, and when confronted by Miss Marple, he confessed, not to the murder, but to what he thought he'd done. There was silence. Then Miss Marple added, very gently, but guilt does not always equal responsibility. Julia finally spoke. Why didn't she just talk to me? Her voice was steady, though her eyes brimmed. Why didn't my foster mother just tell me the truth? Because the truth is rarely simple, Miss Marple replied. People tell themselves they're protecting you, but really they are protecting themselves. The room sat in silence, fire crackling, the weight of it all settling in like snow. After a while, the vicar rose and offered tea, as though the ordinary ritual might smooth the creases left by tragedy. The others accepted. Only Julia refused. Instead, walking to the window and standing there, her arms folded, eyes watching the sky for something no one else could see. Later that evening, Craddock and Miss Marple took a quiet walk down Nettleridge Lane. The snow had been trampled here, but it remained untouched on the roof of the late seamstress's cottage. She had everything prepared, Craddock said. Letters, sketches, a life to begin again. She came so close. Miss Marple nodded. It happens more often than people realize. The new beginning interrupted. He looked over at her. Do you ever tire of solving these puzzles? She smiled faintly. I don't do it for the puzzle, Inspector. I do it because I know what happens when good people are silenced by fear or crushed beneath someone else's secrets. Craddock paused, then reached into his coat pocket. I never did show you this, he said, handing her a folded photograph. It was a picture recent of Julia and Lillian, taken by Felton, as it turned out, during one of their quiet afternoons in his parlour. Lillian sat with her embroidery, Julia beside her laughing. Both looked years younger, unburdened. A glimpse, he said softly, of what could have been. Miss Marple nodded once and tucked the photo into her handbag. They had that moment. At least, she said. And now Julia has the truth. Sometimes that is the most important inheritance of all. They turned back, the cold beginning to bite. Behind them, the empty cottage stood still. But in the lamplight, something glittered in the snow beneath the arbour. A silver thimble, perhaps, or the glint of a dropped pin. a last remnant of the woman who had once sewn lives together, even as hers unravelled. Snow still blanketed the village. By the following morning, but little Davington had begun to stir again. Windows opened briefly to air out parlours, children ventured onto the green to push about melting snowballs, and the clatter of a milk cart echoed along the high street, with familiar rhythm. The worst had passed, it seemed, at least for most, but for Julia Prowse peace had not yet returned. Stitch by stitch, she hid her past in plain sight. Welcome to Tea and Clues. I am your host, Daxon. Comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love hearing your stories too. Your presence here means the world. Let's begin. It was a golden afternoon in the village of Little Davington, and all the best teapots had been brought out to the green. The annual Fête des Fleurs was one of the most anticipated events of the summer season. A modest yet charming gathering of bunting, sponge cake competitions, and floral arrangements so abundant they gave the impression of a wedding rather than a church fundraiser. Miss Marple, now in her 81st year, sat with her back straight beneath the shade of a striped parasol. She sipped her tea quietly, her blue eyes keen beneath the soft brim of her straw hat. Beside her, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Calthorpe, prattled on about the scandalous price of gooseberries this year and the unreliability of the new milkman. I dare say it's the sort of thing one expects these days, Mrs. Calthorpe muttered. No standards at all, Miss Marple murmured in agreement, but watched the crowd with polite detachment. She saw everything, though she rarely let anyone know it. There was the Honourable Reginald Moore, flushed and sweating as he tried to judge, the sponge cakes without offending any of the more formidable entrants. There was young Julia Prowse, all curls and freckles, skipping past the stalls with an eye for mischief. And there was Mrs. Thelma Harding, the village's new seamstress, a quiet woman with deft fingers and a soft northern accent. She had moved into the vacant cottage on Nettleridge Lane only 2 months ago, and though polite, she kept very much to herself. Miss Marple had noted her hands the first time they met, thin, precise, and curiously scarred at the knuckles. The seamstress was now setting up a small embroidery display near the edge of the green. She didn't mingle. She never did. Then at precisely 3:47 p.m., just as the local brass band began a rather unfortunate rendition of Rule Britannia, a shriek pierced the lazy air. People turned. A cluster gathered quickly near the south end of the green, close to the rose arbour. Someone shouted for the doctor. Others backed away, covering their mouths. The shrieking had stopped, but its echo lingered in the sudden silence. Miss Marple rose, her teacup forgotten. Young Julia Prowse, who had been playing hide-and-seek behind the arbour, stood frozen. Her pinafore was smeared with grass. A young constable pushed through the crowd, and behind the arbour they found the body. Mrs. Thelma Harding, the new seamstress, lay slumped on the grass, one side of her head dark with blood, her embroidery, basket tipped beside her, spilling silken thread like entrails. Her eyes were wide open, glassy with surprise. The murmurs began almost at once. Dead? Why, she was just here. Good Lord, was it a stroke? A fall? Must have tripped. Or worse? Miss Marple stood quietly on the edge of the gathering throng, her expression unreadable. She looked down at the scene, then across at the overturned basket. A delicate piece of half-finished embroidery flapped in the breeze, tiny stitches forming a single word, Lillian. But Thelma Harding had always insisted her name was Margaret, and Miss Marple, quite calmly, began to consider whether the woman who had moved into Nettleridge Lane truly was who she claimed to be. By the following morning, the village of Little Davington was abuzz with speculation, horror, and no small degree of theatrical whispering. News of the seamstress's sudden death had spread faster than the fire that once took the bell tower of St. Agnes's Chapel back in 1924. Outside Grice's grocer's, Two elderly sisters, the Misses Bellamy, were locked in intense conversation over the pickle shelf. "Well, I never trusted her," muttered Gwendolen Bellamy, sniffing as though vindicated by the tragedy. "There was something odd about her manner. Always so quiet. You know what they say about quiet women." Her sister Winifred gave a scandalized glance. "She hemmed my curtains just last week. Lovely work, too. But did you hear? There was blood. Real blood, right there on the grass. I nearly fainted when Mrs. Chudley described it. Dr. Graham said she'd been struck on the head. Not an accident at all. Murder, they're saying." The idea sent a ripple of delighted horror through them both. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat in the parlour of the vicarage with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Calthorpe, who was still shaken and dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief steeped in lavender. "Such a terrible thing," Mrs. Calthorpe said for the 5th time. "She was so neat. Always neat, wasn't she? And so self-contained. I remember thinking just the other week that she never once mentioned a husband or family, or even where she came from." Miss Marple was gently knitting. She chose a soft pastel blue today. Her needles clicked quietly as she asked, "Do you recall if she ever received visitors, dear?" Mrs. Calthorpe frowned. "None that I know of. A few parcels, perhaps. Oh, but yes, she did go into town every Tuesday, now I think of it. Always caught the 10:40 train to Market Frimley. Odd time to travel, don't you think?" "Quite," Miss Marple said, though she didn't elaborate. Elsewhere, Inspector Craddock had arrived from the county station. He was no stranger to Little Davington, and though he often found local chatter tiresome, he always paid close attention to what Miss Marple had to say. She hadn't said much yet, but he noticed that she'd wandered off after the body was discovered, calm and silent as ever, toward the arbour. Now, back at the cottage on Nettleridge Lane, Craddock stood in the hallway, peering at a framed embroidery. Sampler hung neatly by the stairs. Margaret Harding, it read, stitched in a childlike hand beneath a faded quote, "Virtue is the highest lace." He opened a drawer. Letters, mostly bills. A few dress orders. No personal correspondence. No photographs too clean. Back on the green, a small tribute of flowers had been laid by the arbour, mostly wild blooms and a few garden roses. One note, written in block capitals, read simply, "Rest in peace, Lillian." Miss Marple stood for a long time reading it. She turned slowly and walked away. By the end of that sombre week, the bunting from the Fête des Fleurs had been quietly taken down. The vicar's wife declared it in very poor taste to leave it up when there'd been a murder. For that is what it was now called, openly and without hesitation, a murder, as the official verdict came in from the coroner's inquest. Blunt force trauma. No signs of robbery. No weapon recovered. Time of death estimated between 3:30 and 4 p.m., just as the band had reached its clattering crescendo. Miss Marple had attended the inquest, of course. She sat near the back, her small frame half lost in the shadows of the gallery, her gloved hands neatly folded on her lap. She did not speak, but she listened, and she noted the way Inspector Craddock fidgeted slightly as the verdict was read, as if it confirmed what he already feared. This case would not resolve itself with a convenient confession or a lurking tramp. Found her afterward on the churchyard path, looking over the low stone wall at the adjacent garden plot, where someone had planted hyacinths far too early. "A quiet word, if I may, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat. She smiled gently. "Of course, Inspector, though I dare say you're rather ahead of me this time." Craddock smiled in return. "I doubt that very much." They began walking slowly. "She wasn't Margaret Harding," he said at last. "Real name, Lillian Rowe. We confirmed it this morning. She had a previous residence in Portsmouth under that name, traced via a fabric supplier who recognized her photograph." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought as much. You see, Margaret Harding is stitched in a child's hand on that sampler in her hallway. but not in her style. It was a different hand entirely. Hers was immaculate. Very fine work. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Noticed that, did you? I always take an interest in stitchery, and in the stories people choose to tell about themselves, or not tell as the case may be. He gave a low whistle. Portsmouth records show Lillian Rowe was involved in a case 10 years ago. A marriage gone wrong, serious accusations, and then she disappeared, vanished. Changed her name, it seems. Margaret Harding never existed. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. People rarely vanish entirely without cause, or without fear. The inspector stopped walking. So then we ask, who from her past might have followed her here, or who here might have discovered the truth? At the Red Hart, the village's only inn, a few locals nursed half-pints and discussed the matter with increasing theatricality. Henry Ford, a retired schoolteacher with a love for speculation, had taken to holding informal crime salons in the snug, complete with deductions over darts. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you never learned more?" "No. We didn't press. It was part of the agreement." She paused. "But she's grown up kind, responsible, quiet mostly. Not perfect, but who is?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed. As she walked home through the gathering mist, Miss Marple reflected on the kind of silence that binds a person, the silence of survival, of secrets passed from mother to daughter without words. Julia might not even know who she truly was, or perhaps she had only just discovered it. Perhaps the woman in the cottage on Nettleridge Lane had finally told her, or meant to, and someone had stopped her. But who? Miss Marple paused on the footpath, beneath the bare-limbed trees. She had watched Julia dart past the stalls on Fete Day, slipping behind the arbour moments before the murder. She had thought nothing of it then, but now someone else had been behind that arbour. Someone older, someone desperate, someone who had sent a letter marked IR. She turned, her mind tracing the web again, seeking its centre, the initials, the threats, the photograph, and then she saw it, clear and cold as the moon rising behind the church steeple. The initials didn't belong to Isabel Rowe. They belonged to Irene Radley, Lillian's former sister-in-law, Michael Rowe's bitter unmarried sister, who had once accused Lillian of destroying her brother's life, the one who still lived in Portsmouth, and who just last week had visited Little Davington for the first time in 10 years. Miss Marple's steps quickened. The past had not only returned, it had walked through the village wearing its oldest mask, revenge. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, the winter air sharp enough to turn her breath to vapour as she tied her scarf beneath her chin. Though she moved slowly, there was determination in her steps as she made her way toward the rectory. She needed a word with Inspector Craddock, privately. The inspector had taken to lodging at the vicarage during the investigation, finding the inn too prone to eavesdropping. He greeted her in the hallway, coat half-buttoned and cup of tea in hand, brows lifting at the sight of her. "You've uncovered something, haven't you?" he said, without ceremony. "I believe so," Miss Marple replied. "Do sit down, dear. You'll want to hear this through." They settled in the drawing-room, where a weak fire flickered and the ticking of the vicar's antique clock punctuated the silence. She took a moment, arranging her thoughts. "Tell me," she began, "what did you find out about Irene Radley?" Craddock leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Radley. She was Lillian Rowe's sister-in-law, the one who tried to get custody of Isabel when Michael vanished. Quite a bitter woman by all accounts. Lived with her mother in Portsmouth until the mother died. Since then she's been renting out rooms in her family home." Miss Marple nodded. "And did she ever visit Little Davington?" Craddock looked uncomfortable. "Yes, just before the fete. She stayed at the Red Hart for one night, booked under a false name. I only uncovered it after your last suggestion. Checked the guest log. She signed in as Clara Iverson. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. A little theatrical, but effective. Did she visit Lillian? She denied it. I imagine she would, because I think she came here. For one reason, Inspector, to confront her former sister-in-law. And not just to confront, to destroy. Craddock looked down at his notes. You believe she killed her. I believe she threatened her, perhaps discovered where Lillian had been living, or that she had made contact with her daughter again. Perhaps she believed Lillian had corrupted Isabel, or was about to. That might be enough to provoke someone like Irene. Craddock sat back, sighing. And the letter with the initials IR, her doing, almost certainly. She had cause, means, and bitterness stored up like dry tinder. He was silent for a long moment. But then, if it was Irene, why? Would she leave the village before the murder? Miss Marple's expression didn't change. Because she may not have done it herself. Craddock stared at her. You're suggesting an accomplice? I'm suggesting that the confrontation happened before the fate, and someone else, someone who overheard, someone involved or affected, may have acted afterward. She placed her teacup down with a quiet clink. You must speak to Julia Prowse again, Inspector. Alone. At the Prowse residence, Julia was found in the small conservatory, surrounded by her sketchbooks. She looked up as Craddock entered, suspicion already clear in her wary posture. I told you everything I know, she said before he'd even sat down. I believe you told us what you thought you should, he replied gently. But I think there's more. Something you've been holding back. Julia hesitated. Is this about the letter? The one in the dress? Craddock blinked. You knew about it? She told me. The night before the fate, She looked down. She was my mother, wasn't she? Craddock leaned in. You knew? I suspected. Bits and pieces. My foster records were sealed, but I found a note once. She wrote to my foster mother anonymously when I was little. I recognized her handwriting when she took in some of my clothes to alter last month. Why didn't you say anything? Because she asked me not to. She said she was trying to make things right, that she was finally going to tell me everything. And then Julia's throat caught, and she looked away. Did you see her that day? She nodded. Before the fate began, I went to her cottage. She gave me a parcel, told me to open it later. It was the start of the wedding dress. She said we could finish it together. Then she told me about the note in the... In case anything happens, she said. I thought she was being dramatic. Craddock was silent. I didn't kill her, Inspector. I believe you, but did you tell anyone else? Julia bit her lip. I think someone followed me that day. When I left the cottage, I saw Mrs. Grantley standing at the corner. She was watching. Beatrice Grantley. Julia nodded. It was Miss Marple who paid Beatrice a visit that afternoon. She brought scones, slightly overbaked, but the gesture served its purpose. Beatrice Grantley lived in a red brick house with starched curtains and a parlour that smelled faintly of lavender and disapproval. She accepted the scones with a stiff smile, and soon the conversation drifted toward the fate, then toward the tragedy. I've heard whispers about the girl, Beatrice said, pursing her lips, that she was hers. That girl who found the body, Julia, quite a wild child, I'm told. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. One often finds strength mistaken for wildness, particularly in girls. Beatrice looked down at her hands. Well, I suppose some secrets are better off buried. Not everyone is fit for motherhood. There it was, just a trace of venom. You didn't think much of Miss Harding, did you? Beatrice hesitated. I didn't trust her. She came here with a false name. Lies always lead to trouble. Yet it was you, wasn't it, who told Mr. Felton she was dangerous? Beatrice's face tightened. I saw you, my dear, Miss Marple continued gently. That evening near the arbour, you were watching Julia. I suspect you followed her to the seamstress's cottage earlier, didn't you? You saw them together." "I didn't do anything," Beatrice said quickly. "No, I imagine not. But you may have said something. Or written. Something, perhaps a note, to someone else, someone more volatile." Beatrice stood. "I think you should leave. Were you in love with her, Mr. Felton?" Felton nodded. "Yes, though I never proposed. I thought about it. I bought a ring. But something stopped me. She seemed afraid. Not of me. Of something else." Craddock's voice was neutral. "Did she mention receiving a threatening letter?" Felton hesitated. "She mentioned someone from her past, a man. She didn't name him, just said he had ruined things once, that he might try to ruin them again. I offered to help her, but she refused, said she would handle it." Craddock leaned forward. "Did she ever mention a child?" A longer pause. "She had a photograph," Felton said softly, "of a little girl. I found her once crying over it. She said she lost her years ago, not in death, but through force. She wouldn't say more." "Did she ever tell you the child's name?" He nodded. "Isabel." That evening Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting in her small parlour as the wind picked up outside. She had spoken to half the village, and her threads, though subtle, had begun to form a pattern. Woman arrives with a false name. Hiding a child or a past or both. A wedding dress commissioned but never delivered. A man with ink-stained fingers and a bruised heart. And someone in Little Davington, someone clever, had known the truth. She reached for a cup of cooling tea and murmured to herself, "People don't kill without reason. They kill out of fear or to keep something hidden." And sometimes, she thought, to keep someone hidden. In the shadows of Nettleridge Lane, a figure walked quickly past the seamstress's shuttered cottage. They paused for only a moment, just long enough to slip a small envelope through the mail. Slot inside was a single slip of paper, with a message printed in blocky, unfamiliar letters. "You didn't tell her everything, I know what you did." But the recipient was long dead. The frost had thickened into a thin glaze of ice along the garden walls of Little Davington, and the dawn was muffled by low grey clouds that promised rain. Still, Miss Marple was up early. She had always believed one learned the most about human nature before breakfast, when the world had not yet remembered to lie. She walked quietly to Nettleridge Lane under the pretence of admiring the holly hedges. In truth, her eyes were on the shuttered cottage that had belonged to the late Lillian Rowe, once known as Margaret Harding. The police had already finished their preliminary search, and Craddock had allowed her a second look, purely for local memory, as he said with a thin smile. She told him she was simply tying up loose ends. He didn't press. Miss Marple let herself in with the borrowed key and paused just inside. Even untouched for days, the house retained the distinct scent of lemon oil and muslin, a careful, woman's home, neat, quiet, yet impersonal, as if its occupant had never truly intended to stay. She moved into the workroom once more. The bolts of fabric had been neatly shelved, the dress forms lined up like silent sentinels. On one, half-draped in white satin, was the beginnings of what might have been a wedding dress. The needle still hung by its last stitch. Miss Marple's eye was drawn to the hem. It had been basted, light, temporary stitches, but on closer inspection, one part of the hem was uneven, slightly bulkier. She bent slowly and examined it with fingers honed by decades of fine needlework. There, almost imperceptibly sewn into the hem, was a folded scrap of cloth, a hidden pocket, created from 2 layers of satin. She carefully removed the thread and pulled the object free. It was a torn piece of paper, fragile and yellowing, as if it had been carried for a very long time. On it, written in smudged fountain pen, were only a few words, difficult to read but unmistakably clear once you saw them. "If anything happens to me, tell Isabel the truth. L." Miss Marple sat back in the creaking workroom chair, her eyes on the note. So, Lillian had hidden it within the wedding dress, perhaps as a backup, an insurance of sorts, something to ensure that if she disappeared again, her story might survive her. But why hide it in a garment that was never delivered? She thought back to Mrs. Pennington's account. A secret commission, expensive lace, no known bride. And then, quite suddenly, Miss Marple's eyes lit with understanding. The gown was for Isabel, not an unknown client, but her own daughter. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just after tea, rubbing his hands to warm them, and looking uncharacteristically curious. "I've had a letter from the Portsmouth authorities," he said without preamble. "About Lillian Rowe. Seems her former husband, Michael Rowe, disappeared 10 years ago after a domestic abuse inquiry. No body ever found. Police suspected her at one point, but couldn't prove anything." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "He was the reason she fled." "Most likely. But here's the twist." Craddock paused, producing a photograph. "This was taken 5 years ago in Lisbon. Guess who turned up under a false identity working on a merchant ship?" She took the photo gently. The man had aged. His once dark hair grey at the temples, but his features were unmistakable. Sharp, narrow eyes and a thin-lipped mouth that spoke of bitterness. "He wore a steward's uniform. Michael Rowe," she murmured. "Under the name Miguel Rojas," Craddock confirmed. "He worked in Europe, then vanished again. We believe he may have re-entered the country under a false passport last spring." Miss Marple looked up. "And you think he followed her here?" Craddock's jaw tightened. "We think he may have found her. Maybe tried to blackmail her, or worse. But there's more to it than that, isn't there?" she said softly. He frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple placed the torn note on the table between them. Craddock read it slowly. Then again. "She feared something enough to hide this," Miss Marple said. "But she also hoped it would be found, which means she believed someone, perhaps even her daughter, might come looking. She had no contact with Isabel as far as we know," Craddock said. "Not openly," Miss Marple replied. "But what if Isabel was closer than anyone realized?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "Are you suggesting she was in the village?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached for her knitting, fingers moving as she thought. She would be of age now, 18 or 19 at least. She'd have her mother's eyes, no doubt, the kind of face people recognize without knowing why. Craddock looked startled. "Do you have someone in mind?" She gave a very faint smile. "I never speculate, Inspector. I observe." That evening, Miss Marple paid an unannounced visit to Julia Prowse's mother, Mrs. Anne Prowse, who lived on Rosebery Lane in a neat, forgettable house that looked precisely like every other on the row, an architectural disguise for lives that were anything but ordinary. Julia had been the one to discover the body, of course. Young, precocious, with her sharp green eyes and hair like wildfire. She had claimed to be playing hide-and-seek behind the arbor, but Miss Marple remembered something else. Julia had not cried. She had looked surprised, yes, but not horrified. Not in the way a child confronted with sudden death ought to look. Anne Prowse welcomed her with a touch of hesitance. "It's about the seamstress, isn't it?" "Dreadful business," she said, fussing with a plate of biscuits. "Julia's still shaken." "I'm sure she is," Miss Marple said mildly. "Might I see her for a moment?" "She's out, taking a walk," Anne said too quickly. "Gets restless, you know. She hasn't been quite right since the party." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Forgive me, dear, but may I ask, Julia is your daughter by adoption, isn't she?" Anne froze, biscuit tray in hand. "Yes, how did you know?" "Just a note in the vicar's register. It was mentioned years ago when your late husband arranged for her schooling." Anne set the tray down carefully. "She was a foster placement at first. Then we applied for full guardianship. She was difficult at times, secretive, but clever, very clever. Her record said her mother was deceased. She was being blackmailed, he declared one evening, slapping his newspaper for emphasis. Had to be, otherwise why the secrecy? Why change your name, Maybe she'd killed before, said Stanley Pott, the baker, who was visibly delighted by the idea. They say some people are born for it. I still say it was a robbery, muttered Mildred Page from behind the bar. Something to do with those expensive silks she used. Maybe she knew something she shouldn't. Miss Marple, having just come in for a quiet cup of tea, the Red Heart's blend being better than the vicarage's, though she never said so aloud, listened to it all with quiet detachment. She took note of the names mentioned, the attitudes, the little inconsistencies in recollection. Then she made her way to Nettleridge Lane once more. The cottage had been sealed off, but with Craddock's assistance, she was allowed a supervised visit. She was interested, she said in her own way, in preserving village memory, which Craddock, to his credit, understood was code for something else entirely. Inside the neat sitting room, she stood still for a moment, breathing it in, the faint scent of lavender polish, clean linens, a trace of perfume too subtle for show but too elegant for rural isolation. She walked slowly toward the fireplace mantel. Above it hung a framed needlework scene, a coastal town rendered in impossibly delicate stitches. She examined it. That, she said softly, is not English work. Craddock blinked. Beg pardon, she pointed. Portuguese azulejos. See the pattern on the rooftops and the church tower? Very distinctive. Lisbon, I believe. Possibly Madeira. You think she lived abroad? Or loved someone who did? In the back room, the inspector pointed to a locked trunk they had found at the foot of the bed. Inside were finished garments, exquisite pieces, each tagged and boxed for delivery. But Miss Marple was drawn to a small box tucked away beneath it. She opened it. Inside lay a faded photograph. Lillian, much younger, smiling beside a man in naval uniform. Behind them, the very cityscape stitched on the wall. Portuguese Navy, Craddock said, peering closer. Could be 10, 15 years ago. Long enough for a scandal to fade, Miss Marple murmured. Or fester. Also in the box, a collection of receipts, letters half burned, and a child's drawing of a house by the sea scrawled in blue crayon. The paper was torn, but a single name remained at the bottom. Isabel. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then handed Craddock the picture. She had a child. That evening, as the village stewed over possibilities and half-truths, Miss Marple sat quietly in her front room, the knitting forgotten in her lap. She stared into the fire and considered. A woman with a new name, a past left behind, a life lived in silence, and now a murder. Not a crime of passion, she thought, not in the moment. It had been planned, cold, precise. Someone had known who Lillian Rowe was, someone had wanted her silence, permanently, and someone in the village had left that note. Not Margaret, Lillian, a name only a few would know. She closed her eyes and went over the names of every person who had met the seamstress. She would start again tomorrow, walk the village, listen politely, ask about curtains and linings and buttonholes, and behind it all she would watch, not for what people said, but what they didn't, because in Little Davington everyone had a secret, and murder, like embroidery, always began with a hidden thread. Little Davington awoke the following morning to a crisp frost that clung to hedgerows like spun sugar and whispered winter's arrival. But the chill in the village came from more than weather. Murder lingered in the narrow lanes and over steaming teacups like a scent that would not dissipate. People looked over their shoulders now, voices lowered when speaking of the deceased or each other. Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary office in the back room of the village hall, between the WI's jam cupboard and a dusty row of hymnals. He had begun interviewing villagers, focusing on those who had direct dealings with the late seamstress. The first to be questioned was Edwin Larkspur, a pale man in his 50s who ran the village post office and claimed an unusually detailed memory for other people's business. His tweed jacket smelled faintly of pipe smoke and mothballs. "I saw her every Monday like clockwork," he said, settling into the chair with a slight wheeze. "Posted small parcels, letters abroad sometimes, once even a package to Portugal. Had to fill out a customs form. Very exacting she was. Didn't like it when I asked questions." "Did you?" Craddock asked with mild curiosity. Larkspur sniffed. "It's only natural to wonder. She was always very careful, never friendly. Oh, polite, yes, but distant. Once I joked she ought to join the choir, and she looked at me as if I'd suggested a trip to the gallows." "And did she ever receive any suspicious mail, anything out of the ordinary?" Larkspur paused. "There was a letter last month, registered post, hand-delivered by courier. She seemed shaken. I remember it because she didn't even open it in the shop, just took it and left straight away. Do you recall the name on the envelope?" Larkspur nodded, eager. "Just initials, IR. That was it. But the handwriting was foreign-looking. Slanted, you know? Like French or something." Craddock made a note of it. "Thank you, Mr. Larkspur. That will be all." Next came Beatrice. Grantley, whose husband had once employed Miss Harding, Lillian, as a seamstress to alter his late mother's dresses for a memorial donation. "She was meticulous," Beatrice said, folding her gloved hands tightly in her lap. "A bit cold, perhaps, but then I suppose one doesn't expect effervescence from a woman living alone." She hesitated. "I shouldn't say this, but she didn't like men." Craddock frowned. "What do you mean?" She flinched. "The first time my husband reached for the measuring tape to hand it to her, she flinched like she thought he was going to strike her. And she never spoke of any gentleman friend, past or present. The kind of woman who keeps her back to the wall. Did she ever seem frightened?" "Not frightened, watchful, always watchful." Craddock filed this quietly in the category of useful observations. Miss Marple, he suspected, would have come to the same conclusion, but would never say it. Allowed until the moment was just right. Meanwhile, Miss Marple herself was making quiet rounds of her own. Her stops, as always, seemed perfectly innocuous. At Mrs. Pennington's haberdashery, she inquired after a certain kind of lace trimming she had seen in one of Miss Harding's designs. "Oh, yes, I remember," chirped Mrs. Pennington. "She bought 6 yards of Venetian lace, real stuff too, about 3 weeks ago. But she never collected the rest of her order. Shame that, I've had to cancel it." "Did she say what it was for?" Miss Marple asked sweetly. "A wedding gown, I think. She said something about a commission for a bride-to-be." "Very hush-hush. Though wouldn't say who. I assumed someone from out of town." A wedding. Miss Marple's mind began turning. That was not the sort of commission she had expected. She knew the social landscape of Little Davington well. No one had announced an engagement lately, much less ordered a bespoke gown in secret. And yet Lillian, Margaret, had purchased rare, expensive lace, for a gown no one had seen. Back at the village hall, Craddock leaned over a growing list of names and timelines. "There's something odd here," he murmured to himself. He circled a name, Andrew Felton, a quiet man, widower, early 40s, bookish. He lived on the edge of the village and ran a small bookbinding service out of his home. According to several villagers, Miss Harding had been seen entering his cottage more than once, ostensibly to repair a torn upholstery seam on his armchair, more than once, and always after dusk. He summoned Felton the next morning. The man arrived, with a soft-spoken manner and ink-stained fingers. His eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "I heard what people are saying," he said without being prompted, "that she was someone else, that she had secrets." "You knew her?" Craddock asked. Felton gave a sad little smile. "I thought I did." He looked away for a moment. She told me her name was Margaret. I never questioned it. Why would I? I suppose we grew close, quietly. We shared a fondness for solitude, for quiet things. She embroidered while I read. We had tea. I told her things I haven't told anyone since my wife died. Miss Marple nodded. Of course, but one last thing. You said once that she flinched when your husband approached her. Tell me, how did you know? You weren't there during the fitting. Beatrice paled. Miss Marple offered a kind smile. We all betray ourselves in time. The trick is knowing where to look. That evening, Miss Marple and Craddock sat once more over the list of suspects. The inspector was frowning deeply. Beatrice didn't kill her, he said, but she stirred things. Fed fear where it was already smouldering, Miss Marple agreed. She planted poison, perhaps without fully realizing it. And the killer, Miss Marple folded her hands. I think we're close. There's just one more conversation I must have. Craddock raised an eyebrow. With Mr. Andrew Felton, she said. It's time we spoke plainly. Andrew Felton welcomed her with a gentleness that always made Miss Marple wary. His cottage was quiet, filled with books and soft lamplight, the scent of glue and leather in the air. I was hoping you'd come, he said. Miss Marple sat across from him. You loved her. Yes, and you were angry when she wouldn't let you protect her. He didn't answer. She told you about Isabel, didn't she? She told me enough. And about Irene Radley? That she might come for her? Felton nodded. She said she'd forgive her if she came. Said she had to forgive or she couldn't move on. I didn't understand it. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. You confronted Lillian the day of the fete, didn't you? She was trying to tell the truth, and you saw it as betrayal. Felton's hands trembled slightly. She was going to leave, he whispered. To go to Portugal with Julia, start over, said it was time. And you couldn't let her, Miss Marple said gently. Not when you had imagined something different, something permanent. He looked at her. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to talk, but she turned away, said goodbye, that's all. I don't remember the rest, only the sound. Silence hung between them. Miss Marple stood slowly. We are not judged only by what we intend, Mr. Felton, but also by what we allow. She left him sitting there, the man who had loved too much and understood too late. Outside the village was dark, but in one window a lamp flickered, a small, steady light, like memory refusing to go out. The snow came overnight, thin, like sifted flour over the rooftops and hedgerows, and with it a stillness that settled over Little Davington like a held breath. The village, despite the murder that had shaken it only days ago, tried to resume its usual rhythm. Tea delivered, papers read, gossip exchanged through half-open doors. But beneath it all lingered the uneasy sense that the truth had not quite finished with them. Inspector Craddock had stayed longer than intended, delayed by paperwork and an unspoken reluctance to leave with the case unresolved in his mind. Andrew Felton had not confessed outright, and there was still no conclusive proof. His account, fragmented, painful, might have been enough to satisfy the law, but not Miss Marple, and not Craddock either. He stood in the hallway of the vicarage, hands deep in his coat pockets, when the call came through. It was the constable. At the next station over. Inspector, you'll want to hear this. A woman came into the post office in Market Frimley this morning, frantic. Said someone had broken into her house last night. Name's Irene Radley. Craddock's brows lifted. She's not local. What was she doing in Frimley? Visiting. Family, she said. But the odd thing is she didn't call it a burglary. What then? She said someone was looking for something. They didn't take anything, just rifled through drawers. Left a note. Craddock frowned. A note? Yes. She wouldn't say what it said. Said it was personal. But she looked scared, sir. very scared. He thanked the constable and rang off, his mind racing. If someone had gone after Radley now, then the crime at Little Davington had left unfinished threads, and someone else other than Felton was still pulling at them. Miss Marple was in her garden, snipping back her wintering roses when Craddock found her. "I think we've overlooked someone," he said without preamble. She didn't look up. "I agree. Irene Radley reported a break-in last night, in Frimley. She says someone left her a message." Miss Marple looked up. Her clippers paused mid-cut. "Oh dear," she said. "So it's begun." "What's begun?" She gestured for him to sit on the bench beside her, and once he did, she placed her gloved hands in her lap. "The secateurs forgotten. Someone in this village is trying to erase the past," she said softly. "And they're not done yet." Craddock hesitated. "Do you still believe Felton is responsible for Lillian's death?" Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "I believe he thought he was." He frowned. "Thought?" "He struck her," she said. "That much I'm sure of. In a fit of grief, rage, fear, it doesn't matter which, but I believe Lillian was alive when he fled." Craddock's eyes widened. "You think someone else finished it?" "More than think. I'm certain." She reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a small envelope. Aged and brittle, the seal broken. "This," she said, "was tucked into a sewing box in Lillian's workroom. It had fallen beneath the false bottom, quite by chance." "I doubt. Even the police noticed." Craddock took the letter and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single page, handwritten in Lillian's tight, elegant script. "If you find this, I am gone. There are people who would see me silenced, for things I did, for what I left behind. But Isabel is innocent. She is everything good that came from that terrible time. Protect her, and if you must blame someone, blame me. I should have told the truth sooner." Craddock exhaled slowly. "This doesn't sound like someone afraid of Andrew Felton." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It sounds like someone afraid of exposure, someone who feared what Isabel might discover." Craddock leaned forward. "Do you think Irene Radley found her?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "No. I think Irene came to threaten Lillian, but I don't think she killed her. I think she left furious, perhaps even believing she'd won. But someone else, someone who overheard their conversation, knew exactly what was at stake." Craddock's mind whirled. "Then who?" Miss Marple looked at him gravely. "Anne Prowse." He blinked. "Julia's foster mother?" Miss Marple nodded. She was always too quick to say Julia was difficult, and too quick to claim ignorance about Lillian's identity. But if she had known, from the beginning, if she had hidden it, well then the return of the mother could only mean trouble. Emotional trouble, legal trouble, perhaps even a threat to her status. Craddock sat back, stunned. "You think she found out they'd met? That Julia and Lillian were reconnecting?" "I think she followed Julia the day of the fete," Miss Marple said calmly. "I think she saw them together, and I think she waited. Perhaps she even watched as Felton fled the arbor, panicked and believing he had killed Lillian, and then she stepped in." "To make sure," Craddock murmured. "To make certain there was no more truth left to tell." Miss Marple nodded. "There is more than one kind of murder, Inspector. One committed in the heat of emotion, and another colder, planned, precise." They sat in silence for a moment. Craddock stood abruptly. "I'll question her." "No," Miss Marple said. "She'll deny it, but she's clever and careful. She won't crack under pressure." Craddock's brow furrowed. "Then what do we do?" "We give her a reason to believe she's been discovered," Miss Marple said. "We make her afraid." He looked at her warily. "Are you proposing a trap?" "Only a conversation," Miss Marple said mildly. "One designed to let her betray herself. They always do. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Anne Prowse to tea. I thought, she said, that perhaps we might talk, woman to woman, about the burden of protecting a child. Anne smiled stiffly. Julia has always been a handful. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Very bright girls often are. So clever sometimes that they find their way to the truth even when others try to bury it. Anne's eyes flickered. I don't follow. She knows, you know, that Lillian was her mother. Anne's teacup paused just short of her lips. She also knows about the letter, the note in the hem, about the dress, about the meeting at the arbor. Anne placed the cup down. I didn't know anything about that. Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, but you did. You knew the moment you saw them together. Anne stood abruptly. I think I've stayed long enough. I think you stayed too long in the arbor that day, Miss Marple said evenly. Long enough to see Andrew Felton run. Long enough to make sure Lillian Rowe never told anyone the truth, not even her daughter. Anne's lips parted. Shock. Fury, panic. Then she turned and fled. Miss Marple sat very still for several minutes. Then she reached for the telephone. That evening, a small crowd gathered by the arbor once more. Craddock, 2 constables, and a subdued Anne Prowse hands. Cuffed and face blank. I only meant to scare her, she said once numbly. I didn't know it would be so fast. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. 2 murderers, he said softly. In one quiet afternoon. She shook her head. 1 killer. 1 catalyst. Both trying to erase the past. And Isabel, he asked. What of her? Miss Marple looked across the green where Julia stood silently, eyes fixed on the arbor. She'll have questions, but she has her mother's strength. Then, gently, almost to herself, Miss Marple added, some threads must be cut to start a new pattern. For several days after the arrest, little Davington was unusually quiet. Not the warm, companionable quiet of summer evenings or snowy holidays, but the brittle, uneasy silence of a place not yet sure it is safe again. Villagers kept to their homes, children played more softly. The postman avoided lingering, and even the bell at St. Agnes rang with a subdued tone. Miss Marple continued with her usual routines, her walks, her church attendance, her knitting, and observed with her usual discretion the way the village reacted not to murder but to justice. There were those who whispered about Anne Prowse's guilt, with barely concealed relish, and others who quietly admitted that something about her had always felt restrained. But what most failed to see, Miss Marple thought, was the damage, done not by evil people but by ordinary people acting out of fear, and it was fear, she believed, that still held one final thread in this web, Andrew Felton. He had neither been charged nor officially cleared, and though Craddock had his doubts, there remained a lingering uncertainty. Andrew's partial confession had placed him at the scene, his account filled with guilt and memory clouded by panic. But there was a detail, small and nagging, that didn't sit right with Miss Marple. Lillian's injuries, according to the coroner, had not come from a single blow, but 2. The first one blunt, but not fatal. The second, calculated. Behind the ear, deliberate and efficient. That was not the action of a man overcome by passion. That was someone thinking. Miss Marple decided it was time to test what Andrew truly remembered and what he did not. She arrived at his cottage just after luncheon, carrying a folded piece of white satin and a small paper parcel under her arm. Felton greeted her with his usual soft, distant manner. He looked thinner, as though the weight of the past had taken up permanent residence in his spine. Miss Marple, he said, managing a faint smile, I suppose you've come to ask what more I remember. Not quite, she said, taking a seat. I've come to return something. She unwrapped the satin carefully on his table, revealing the half-finished wedding dress Lillian had been working on. The stitches were delicate but precise, and the lace had been positioned with a meticulous hand. Felton looked at it for a long time, his face unreadable. "She was making it for Isabel," he said finally. "She said she hoped to give her something beautiful before she explained everything, a way to make a memory that would last beyond the pain." Miss Marple nodded. "And did she tell you when she planned to speak with her?" Felton hesitated. "She said the fate, that she would meet her there, quietly, away from anyone else." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then why, Mr. Felton, were you waiting near the arbor?" He blinked. "What?" "You were seen," she said gently, "standing behind the flower displays long before Lillian arrived, before even Julia got there. Why?" Felton looked down at his hands. "I was afraid that she'd change her mind, that she'd leave without saying goodbye." "It was going to leave with Isabel," Miss Marple said. "You knew that?" Felton didn't answer. Miss Marple stood, walked to the mantel, and placed the paper parcel atop it. "She trusted you, Mr. Felton, with the most precious thing she had, her truth. And she believed, perhaps wrongly, that you loved her enough to let her go." He turned sharply. "I did love her. Then why did you go back?" she asked very quietly. Felton froze. "You said you struck her in panic, then fled. But you didn't flee the fate, did you?" "Not right away. Someone saw you return. 10 minutes later, you reappeared by the flower tent, flushed, hands shaking. A witness thought you were ill." Felton's voice was hoarse. "I had to be sure she was alive." Miss Marple turned, but she wasn't, was she? He looked at her, and for the first time there was no softness in his face, only a bleak, desperate resignation. "She was breathing when I left her, barely. She opened her eyes. I panicked. I thought, if she lived, she'd leave, and I'd lose her again, just like before. So you returned." "I waited. I told myself I only wanted to see, to be sure, but then I saw her move. She was trying to sit up. And you finished it." Felton closed his eyes. "It was quick. It had to be." Miss Marple said nothing. She looked down at the delicate gown, so full of promise of unspoken reconciliation, and then at the man who had stolen both. "She would have forgiven you," she said, almost to herself. Felton laughed once, bitterly. That was the worst of it. She always forgave, even when people didn't deserve it. There was silence. Miss Marple picked up the parcel and handed it to him. "I thought you should see this before Inspector Craddock arrives." Felton opened it slowly. Inside was the letter Lillian had written to Isabel. The original, not the note sewn into the hem. She sat at the edge of the green on a weathered wooden bench, the very same one her mother had often occupied in quiet moments. The faint scratch of frost beneath her gloves as she clutched the edges of the half-finished wedding gown in her lap felt sharper than the wind. She had carried it with her like a relic, unsure whether she was preserving something or punishing herself with it. She didn't hear Miss Marple approach. Only when the older woman lowered herself to the bench beside her, adjusting her skirt and pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, did Julia stir. "I never got to say goodbye," the girl said softly, not turning. "No," Miss Marple said, "but you said something far more important. You forgave her." A silence followed. Wind rustled the bare hedgerows, and somewhere across the green the bell from St. Agnes tolled the hour. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Julia whispered. "She's gone. The truth's out, but everything still feels hollow." Miss Marple considered this. Hollows are natural after an unburial. When secrets come to light, they leave behind the spaces they once filled, but that doesn't mean you must live in them. Julia turned to her finally. Her eyes were weary, but no longer wild. She didn't deserve what happened. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but she left something of herself with you. That gown, that name, the courage to live without lies." Julia blinked back sudden. Tears. She thought I might want to become a seamstress too. Said I had good hands for it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I expect she said that because she saw herself in you. They sat in quiet reflection, 2 generations bound not by blood but by witness. Later that day Miss Marple found herself once again in the company of Inspector Craddock, this time in the modest reading room of the Red Hart. The fireplace was low, crackling only occasionally, and Craddock had a mug of tea in hand, the steam rising between them like a fog lifting from a still pond. "So that's it then," he said. "Charges confirmed against Felton. Anne Prowse to stand trial as accessory. Irene Radley, we've kept under surveillance. She's not facing charges, but she won't trouble anyone again. She's returned to Portsmouth, I believe, in rather humbler spirits." Miss Marple nodded. "Some crimes are of omission, others of poison whispered at the right moment." Craddock ran a hand through his hair. "There's something about this case, though, it won't leave me. I keep thinking of how many times it might have gone differently, if someone had listened earlier, if someone had spoken one truth sooner." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked quietly in her lap. "That's the tragedy of human nature, Inspector. It runs on fear and hope in equal measure, and rarely chooses the one we need most at the right time." Craddock looked at her. "And you? What do you think of how it ended?" She considered the question, then answered slowly. "I think a woman died trying to reclaim her name. A man killed for love he mistook as ownership, and a child grew up among lies only to become stronger than them." The inspector sipped his tea, the weight of her words settling over him like snow. Before they parted, he asked, "Will you write to Julia?" "I already have," Miss Marple said. "Just a few lines, encouragement and a pattern, something to finish." That night, the wind rattled the panes of Miss Marple's cottage, but inside all was warm. She sat by the fire, the photograph of Lillian and Julia tucked beside her book of Psalms, and her knitting half done beside the armchair. She did not work on it just yet. Instead, she allowed herself to rest, to think, not of the murderer, but of the girl left behind. Somewhere, down Nettleridge Lane, the cottage that once belonged to Lillian Rowe remained dark, though not abandoned. Julia would return for it soon enough. The parish council had agreed, discreetly and with Miss Marple's influence, that she could keep it until a decision was made. For now, it was hers. 3 days later, a parcel arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Brown paper, tied neatly with string, no return address. Inside, wrapped in soft muslin, was the wedding dress. Finished, no note. But embroidered delicately along the hemline, stitched in silver thread, were the words, "For those who remember." Miss Marple pressed her fingers gently to the cloth, her heart lifting quietly within her chest. Outside, the first crocus pushed through the snow. A tiny shoot. New life, soft, uncertain, but determined. And within the quiet village of Little Davington, spring had already begun to stir. The village of Little Davington slipped into spring the way it always did, subtly, without grandeur. The hedges greened slowly, the daffodils emerged from sleep as if shy to show themselves, and the air warmed just enough for windows to be cracked during morning tea. And yet, something was different this year. A quiet shift in the villages, collective rhythm. It wasn't just the seasons changing. Miss Marple noticed it in the way the shopkeepers greeted one another with gentler voices, in how the gossip, once so sharp-edged, now had the tone of caution rather than glee. The murder of Lillian Rowe had not just shocked the village, it had left it wiser. At the heart of that change, though few knew it, was a girl with a new understanding of who she was, and a woman, now gone, who had died trying to pass that truth. Out on a soft April morning, Miss Marple walked down Nettleridge Lane once more, her steps slow but deliberate. The cottage was no longer shuttered. Julia had returned. The lace curtains were fresh, the front steps swept. A pot of hyacinths sat on the windowsill, Lillian's favourite. Julia opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. She wore a thimble on one finger and a chalk pencil tucked behind her ear. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, ushering her inside. The workroom had been transformed. Where once there had been hushed precision, now there was light, movement, life. Sketches tacked to walls, bolts of fabric unrolled mid-project, a newly oiled sewing machine humming softly in the corner. Miss Marple looked around with gentle satisfaction. "You've made it your own," Julia smiled. "I'm calling it row and thread. For her, for me." Miss Marple placed her handbag neatly on a chair. "Fitting and elegant, just like the woman who raised you and the one who bore you." They had tea in the garden, where crocuses bloomed in tight little clusters along the brick path. "Everyone's been kind," Julia said after a pause. "Even Mrs. Grantley came by with a note of apology. Said she never meant for things to go as far as they did." "Most people don't," Miss Marple replied. "But consequences rarely ask for permission." Julia sipped her tea. "I've been reading my mother's letters, the ones she kept but never sent. There's one she wrote to me on my 7th birthday. She described a dress she'd imagined for me, with pearl buttons and a velvet ribbon. She never made it, but I could see it. I think I always could." Miss Marple smiled. "She never stopped thinking of you." There was silence between them, but a warm one, filled with quiet understanding. At last, Julia looked up. "You never told me," she said. "How you knew. It wasn't just Felton." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I suppose it was little things. Felton's remorse didn't match the brutality of the final blow. Lillian's last note referenced a specific kind of fear, cold, deliberate. Not the fear of an angry man, but the fear of someone who thinks she's being erased." "And the letter in the hem?" Julia asked. Miss Marple nodded. "Ah, yes. That was what changed everything. Lillian was preparing for something, not running, not hiding, but passing something on. People who plan escape don't embroider messages into gowns. They write them. They flee. This was a ritual, a handover, which meant she expected to be here longer. She didn't think she was in danger. Not from Felton. Not yet." Julia looked down. "But she didn't see Anne coming." "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "because some dangers wear familiar faces." She took a final sip of her tea and set the cup down. "Your life will not be simple, Julia, but it will be yours. And I believe more than ever you'll shape something beautiful from all this, not despite what happened, but because of it." They stood together then, walking slowly to the edge of the garden, where new ivy crept up the old stone wall. Julia turned back once, eyes thoughtful. "You'll come again, won't you?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled. "Of course, my dear. After all, we must keep an eye on how the next collection turns out." Julia laughed softly. As Miss Marple walked back toward the village, cane tapping gently on the stones, she reflected, as she often did in times like these, on how strange it was that endings so often felt like beginnings. Lillian Rowe had died, trying to reclaim a name, but she'd succeeded in something far more important. She had returned a name to her daughter, and in doing so, she had unspooled the threads of old lies, knot by knot, until the truth could be sewn again. Miss Marple turned the corner toward the green, where early market stalls were being set up, and children's laughter carried across the grass. She adjusted her hat, tucked her hands in her gloves, and smiled to herself. Little Davington, for all its secrets, would be just fine. And so, in her quiet, composed way, she moved on, as she always did, as she always would.